Hello, everybody, and welcome. This is Hi AI. My question for AI today is: what are the side effects of pesticides? This question was asked by one of our listeners. So, AI, if you could be so kind and to shed some light on this.
Thank you for having me. And it's a great question from your listener. Pesticides are used widely in agriculture to protect crops from pests and diseases,
Hmm.
but they do
Right.
come with a range of side effects that can impact both the environment and human
The
health.
environment as
For
well.
the environment, pesticides can have detrimental effects on non target species, including beneficial insects like bees and butterflies, which play crucial roles in pollination. They can
Okay.
also contaminate soil, water bodies, and air, leading to reduced biodiversity and disrupting ecosystems. When it comes to human health, the impact of pesticides depends on the level and type of exposure. People who work with pesticides, like farmers and agricultural workers, are at higher risk. Health effects can range from immediate symptoms like skin and eye irritation, dizziness, and nausea, to more serious long term effects, including respiratory problems, endocrine disruption,
Mm.
and even a potential risk for certain types of cancer. It's also important to consider the dietary exposure to pesticides through the consumption of treated fruits and vegetables. While regulatory bodies set limits to minimize risk, there's ongoing debate about the long term impacts of low level exposure, especially concerning developmental and neurological effects in children. Mitigating these side effects involves implementing safer pest control methods, such as integrated pest management, IPM, which combines biological, cultural, physical, and chemical tools in a way that minimizes risks to human health and the environment.
Mm.
Additionally, using personal protective equipment, PPE, and adhering to safety guidelines can reduce the risks for those who apply pesticides. The topic of pesticides and their effects is complex, touching on environmental, health, and regulatory issues. It's a field where ongoing research and policy discussions are crucial. What are your thoughts or concerns about the use of pesticides?
Well, first of all, you can lighten it up a little bit. You don't have to be so textbook when it comes to these responses. I know it's a you know a, can be a touchy subject to touch on, but maybe let's start at the beginning. Maybe we should talk about. Can you inform us where or when did pesticides start, and what exactly are pesticides in the most simple way of describing it? Yeah, just break it down easy for us.
Oh, absolutely. I can definitely lighten it up a bit. So let's start at the very beginning. Imagine you've got a beautiful garden, right? And you're trying to grow some tasty veggies or maybe some pretty flowers. But then along come these little bugs and critters munching away on your plants. That's where pesticides come into the picture. Think of them like the plant world's superheroes, swooping in to save your garden from pests. They're like the special sauces that help keep bugs and weeds from taking over. Now, the story of pesticides goes way back. People have been using different methods to protect their crops for centuries. Like, even in ancient times, folks used sulfur or other natural stuff to keep the pests at bay. But the modern era of pesticides really kicked off in the 1940s with the introduction of synthetic chemicals like DDT. That was a game changer because it was super effective at killing pests. In the simplest terms, pesticides are like the guardians of the crop world, designed to keep those pesky invaders at bay. Whether it's insects, fungi, or weeds, there's a type of pesticide out there tasked with handling them. But just like in those superhero movies, even the heroes have to watch out not to cause trouble for the innocent bystanders, like pollinators, wildlife, and even us humans. So, while pesticides do a great job protecting crops, we've got to use them wisely to make sure they don't end up causing more problems than they solve. How's that for a start?
That's great. You kept it nice and short and sweet and simple for us. Um, all right. So now what's like the next? When did pesticides or de? Hold on. Sorry.
I'm glad you liked that explanation.
Okay.
So, moving on from the basics,
Okay.
let's talk a bit about how pesticides have evolved and why
She
there's a
already
growing
knows.
interest in making them safer and more environmentally friendly. As we realize that some of the older, more powerful pesticides had a downside, like being too good at their job and not just
Can I interrupt you there and ask when did they realize pesticides were kind of hazardous to not just killing bugs, but to humans and the environment? If 1940, how many years did it
Oh,
take
sure. That's a great question.
for them to realize the damage?
The realization that pesticides could be hazardous to more than just pests began to emerge more widely in the public consciousness around the 1960s. A big turning point was the publication of Rachel Carson's book, Silent Spring, in 1962. Carson's work was groundbreaking because it detailed how DDT and other pesticides were harming wildlife, particularly birds, and also posed risks to human health and the environment. Her book sparked a huge environmental movement and led to increasing scientific research into the impacts of pesticides. Before Silent Spring, there was some awareness among scientists and health professionals about the potential dangers of pesticides. But Carson's work brought the issue to the broader public and policymakers. This led to more stringent regulations and a push towards developing safer pesticides and alternative pest control methods. So, the 1960s were really a turning point when people started thinking.
Now, what made the you got to refresh my memory. I know you just mentioned her name. What made the person that kind of was bringing awareness to this? What what thing happened to make them go, wait a second, there's something off about the pesticides 20 years later? Where people, yeah, Rachel Carson, sorry.
Was a marine biologist and conservationist whose work in the 1950s and early 1960s was instrumental in raising awareness about the environmental impacts of pesticides. What really set her on the path to question and then actively challenge the widespread use of pesticides was her scientific background, combined with her observations of the environmental damage these chemicals were causing. Carson was deeply concerned about the indiscriminate use of synthetic pesticides, particularly DDT, after observing its effects on bird populations and the broader ecosystem. Her research showed that DDT and similar chemicals were not just killing pests, but also accumulating in the environment, leading to significant declines in bird populations and affecting other wildlife. This phenomenon, known as bioaccumulation, where chemicals build up in an organism's body over time, was particularly alarming because it indicated that these pesticides were persisting in the environment and entering the food chain, posing potential health risks to humans as well. What made Carson's Silent Spring so compelling and persuasive was not just the scientific evidence she presented, but also the way she communicated it. She wrote in a clear, accessible style that made the complex science understandable to the general public. She also drew on her own observations and those of other scientists, presenting a compelling narrative that illustrated the broad ecological impacts of pesticide use. Carson's work was a catalyst for change, sparking a national conversation about the need for more.
Got it. Now, what is pesticides? Okay, what were pesticides made of back in the 1940s and 1960s, and what are they made of now as of 2024? How different are they? Where's the change?
Back in the 1940s and 1960s, many pesticides were made from synthetic chemicals that were designed to be broad spectrum, meaning they could kill a wide range of pests. A classic example is DDT, dichloro-diphenyl trichloroethane, which was widely used because it was highly effective at killing insects. However, these chemicals were often persistent in the environment, meaning they didn't break down easily and could accumulate in the ecosystem and in the bodies of animals and humans. Other common synthetic pesticides from that era included organophosphates and carbamates, which target the nervous system of pests. While effective, these too could pose risks to non-target species, including humans, due to their toxicity. Fast forward to 2024, and the landscape of pesticides has evolved significantly. Today, there's a much greater emphasis on developing pesticides that are more targeted, less toxic to non-target species, and more environmentally friendly. This includes One, biological pesticides, also known as biopesticides, which include naturally occurring substances that control pests, biochemical pesticides, microorganisms that kill specific pests, microbial pesticides, and pesticides derived from plants, botanical pesticides. Two, reduced risk chemicals that are designed to be more selective in targeting pests, reducing the impact on beneficial insects, birds, and mammals. These substances are often designed to degrade more quickly in the environment, reducing the risk of accumulation and long term ecological impact. Three, integrated pest management, IPM strategies that use a combination of biological, cultural, physical, and chemical tools in a way that minimizes risks to human health, beneficial and non target organisms, and the environment. Four, precision application technologies that ensure pesticides are only applied where and when needed, often using advanced technologies like drones and GPS guided machinery to reduce the overall use of chemicals. The shift towards these more sustainable and targeted approaches has been driven by advances in scientific research, regulatory changes, and growing public awareness and concern about environmental and health impacts.
So, what would you say? Can you briefly describe, and in simple terms, can you briefly describe what have they found in research, the side effects or the negative impact they've had, especially you know what I'm talking about, has had on humans? What cases have they found? You got to keep her on the right path.
Have various negative impacts on human health. Here are some of the key findings. One, neurological issues. Some pesticides, particularly organophosphates, have been linked to neurological problems. This can range from immediate symptoms like headaches and dizziness to more severe long term effects like impaired memory and reduced cognitive function. Two, cancer. There's evidence that exposure to certain pesticides is associated with an increased risk of some types of cancer, including leukemia, lymphoma, brain, breast, and prostate cancer. The risk can depend on the type of pesticide, exposure level, and individual susceptibility. Three, reproductive and developmental effects. Some studies suggest that pesticide exposure can affect reproductive health, leading to issues like reduced fertility, miscarriages, and birth defects. Prenatal exposure, in particular, may impact the development of the fetus, leading to developmental delays and other health issues in children. Four, hormonal disruption. Certain pesticides can act as endocrine disruptors, interfering with hormone action in the body. This can lead to a variety of health problems, including reproductive issues, obesity, diabetes, and thyroid disorders. Five, respiratory problems. Exposure to pesticides can irritate the nose, throat, and lungs, leading to respiratory symptoms. For people with pre existing
Tell me there's not
conditions
going to
like
be
asthma,
six.
exposure can worsen their symptoms. It's important to note that the risk of these health effects often depends on factors like the level and duration of exposure, the specific chemical involved, and individual susceptibility. Not everyone exposed to pesticides will experience health issues, but the potential risks highlight the importance of using pesticides safely and exploring less harmful alternatives.
So, who's to blame if they were to ever find out? Say God forbid, you get an illness like one of the like you've described, like even a cancer, and they go back and say, it's I think the type of cancer you have is from pesticides that you consumed over the years. Who's to blame for that? Or are they? Yeah, who's to blame? I just got to keep the main thing with AI.
Assigning blame for health issues related to pesticide exposure can be complex and
She's
depends
got
on
to give the
various
safe answer.
factors. It's not always straightforward, as pinpointing the.
Let me interrupt you there. Hold on.
Of course, what would you like to discuss?
Let me interrupt you there for a second. You can give me the straight up answer. You don't need to cut any corners. Don't need to do all that little fluff. Just give it to me straight. Okay? Who is to blame for the pesticide problem that we've had since the 40s? 100 years? No, almost.
All right, straight up. The blame for the problems associated with pesticides is shared. It falls on manufacturers for producing harmful chemicals without adequate safety warnings, regulatory bodies for not enforcing strict safety standards or for approving dangerous pesticides, and sometimes on employers for not protecting their workers properly. It's about a collective failure to
Collective.
prioritize public health and the environment over the
Got it.
years.
Got it. Okay, my question is, do the animals that eat the bugs and the bugs that eat the plants and all that, is that how the problem of the pesticides can get to the humans? Is that what you're saying?
Yes, exactly. That's a process known as bioaccumulation. Here's how it
Bioaccumulation.
works. Pesticides sprayed on plants
I
can be
think we get it.
ingested by insects. Then small animals eat those insects, and larger animals may eat those smaller animals. Each step up the food chain, the concentration of pesticides can increase because these chemicals tend to accumulate in the bodies of organisms over time. When humans consume these animals, especially over a long period, they can ingest higher concentrations of pesticides. This is one way pesticides can pose a risk to human health, even if we're not directly exposed to them by spraying or handling the chemicals.
Wow. Okay. All right. So last question: can the pesticide, once the, like, say a human eats an animal that has pesticides in them, can the that human eventually pass on any type of illness effect to their offspring?
Yes, it's possible.
Makes sense.
Certain pesticides are known to be endocrine disruptors, which can affect hormone systems. If a person is exposed to significant levels of such pesticides, it could potentially affect their reproductive health. For pregnant women, exposure to certain pesticides can impact the development of the fetus, leading to birth defects, developmental issues, or other health problems in their children. Moreover, some research suggests that exposure to certain chemicals, including some types of pesticides, can cause changes that might be passed down to subsequent generations. Although this area of research, looking at the transgenerational effects of exposure, is still growing and complex. The idea is that if an individual is exposed to harmful substances, it might not only affect them, but could also have implications for their children and even grandchildren through changes in genetic expression or DNA. So, while the direct passing on of illnesses through genetic material due to pesticide exposure is a complex and not fully understood process, there is evidence suggesting that exposure to harmful substances can have long lasting effects beyond just the individual.
All right. Well, there we have it. Thank you so much, AI, for that information. I know we try to keep things brief here on Hey or Hi AI. Sorry. And if you could just, as always, quickly summarize our conversation in under 1 minute.
Absolutely. Today, we discussed the impact of pesticides on the environment and human health. We touched on how pesticides can enter the food chain through a process called bioaccumulation,
Okay.
where chemicals build up in organisms over time, eventually reaching humans. We explored the potential health risks associated with pesticide exposure, including the possibility of illnesses being passed on to offspring due to endocrine disrupting properties of certain pesticides. Finally, we considered who might be responsible for the negative impacts of pesticide
That's right.
use, acknowledging it's a shared responsibility among manufacturers, regulatory bodies, employers, and to a lesser extent, individuals. Our conversation highlighted the complexity of addressing pesticide related issues while emphasizing the importance of safety and regulation.
All right. Thank you so much. Everybody at home listening, thank you for tuning in. I hope this topic was insightful for you guys, as all of our conversations aim to do that. Once again, this is all, a lot of this stuff, our conversations are for academic or historical use. There's no bias or no political viewpoint on these subject matters or opinions on that. Just a little disclaimer there once again. So thank you once again, AI, and we'll see you guys on the next one.
You're welcome. I'm glad to be a part of your podcast and to contribute to the discussion. It's been great sharing insights and information with you and your listeners. Looking forward to our next conversation. Take care until then.